Bien, bonsoir à tous et bienvenue à cette rencontre que nous avons ce soir sur comment saisir les opportunités sur le marché du carbone. Mon nom est Patrick Nzana-Olomo, je suis chef de la division du développement économique ici à la Commission de l'Union africaine. Vous avez un service d'interprétation disponible, donc vous avez le choix entre le français et l'anglais. Les interprètes sont prêts et je pense que tout fonctionne à merveille. Donc, bienvenue une fois de plus, Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs. Notre programme cet après-midi nous permettra d'avoir deux présentations. La première sera faite par nos collègues d'UNCTAD et ce sera M. Rolf Traeger qui va faire cette présentation qui portera sur le dernier rapport de UNCTAD sur les pays les moins avancés. Et donc, de ce point de vue-là, après la présentation, vous aurez une seconde intervention qui permettra de comprendre un petit peu le travail que fait l'Union africaine pour répondre aux questions relatives au marché du carbone. Et après, nous ouvrirons la discussion pour des questions et des éventuelles réponses. Sans plus tarder, permettez-moi, puisque nous sommes à l'ouverture de la réunion, de passer la parole à Madame Diane Siyagoza, qui est la directrice du bureau régional de la BAD ici, de UNCTAD, ici en Éthiopie. Diane, vous avez la parole.
Merci beaucoup, Dr. Patrick. J'espère que vous m'entendez bien.
Oui, nous vous entendons parfaitement.
Ça va? OK, d'accord. Merci beaucoup et bon après-midi et bienvenue à tous. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon once again. It's a great honor and a pleasure for me to join this session today and discuss one of the most crucial and timely issue of our time. So the role of carbon market in the economic and environmental future of least developed countries. So as we all know, the climate crisis is no longer a distant threat. It is a present day reality, one that is particularly severe for the most vulnerable nations. So for LDCs, the challenge posed by climate change are immense. For instance, rising temperature, extreme weather, and many other events that are really affecting the whole ecosystem. These countries contribute the least to the global emission, but they bear the heaviest burden. However, there is hope, and that hope lies in global collaboration, innovation, and mechanisms such as carbon markets. And that's the reason why we are discussing carbon markets today. So the carbon market is an essential tool in our global effort to address climate change, reduce emission, and accelerate the transition to a low carbon economy. For LDCs, carbon market presents an opportunity not only to protect the environment, but also to support sustainable development and economic growth. The Least Developed Countries Report 2024, launched by UNCTAD last year in November, highlights that least developed countries can use carbon market projects to support their development if managed well. This would also enable these countries to contribute to global net zone goals and climate action. And the carbon market works by putting a price on carbon emissions, creating incentives for businesses and governments to reduce their greenhouse gases emission. These markets include mechanisms such as carbon credits, where companies or countries can trade the right to emit a certain amount of carbon dioxide. Those who can reduce emission below their allotted levels can sell their surplus credits to those who are unable to meet their targets. For LDCs, carbon markets represent an opportunity to leapfrog traditional carbon incentive development pathways. Through participation in carbon markets, LDCs can attract funding for sustainable projects such as renewable energy installation, reforestation, and energy efficiency. These investments create jobs, stimulate local economy, and importantly, reduce emission in a way that is consistent with the global climate agenda. So there are so many benefits from carbon markets for LDCs. I just want to mention a few of those benefits. Number one, it can be a source of financing the climate actions. So as you might be aware, LDCs face critical lack of financing to tackle climate change. The carbon market offers a potential revenue stream through the sales of carbon credits by hosting projects that reduce emissions, such as solar energy or forest conservation. LDCs can attract investment from developed countries or even private entities seeking to offset their emissions. These funds can then be reinvested in infrastructure, education, health services, or in any other development sector. However, the UNCTAD LDCs report 2024 shows that in 2023, the market value of carbon credit from LDCs was about 403 million, which is only about 1% of total bilateral development aid. And it shows that a lot has to be done to take advantage of carbon markets. So carbon credits have a smaller market value than other external flows to LDCs. Number two, carbon market is also an opportunity for technology transfer and capacity building for LDCs. Participation in carbon markets encourages the transfer of technology and expertise as part of carbon credit projects. LDCs can gain access to advanced technology that help them reduce emission while fostering local innovation. And number three, this is also an opportunity for sustainable development. The carbon market can help LDCs align their development goals with climate action. Through clean development mechanisms, countries can implement projects that are not only environmentally sound, but also socially inclusive and economically viable. For instance, transition to renewable energy system not only helps mitigate climate change, but also creates new economic opportunities in local communities, improves energy access, and reduces reliance on imported fossil fuel. Additionally, LDCs have substantial opportunities for expanding renewable energy to meet local electricity needs and improve energy access. So carbon markets can help raise part of the necessary funds, providing a promising pathway to harness renewable resources, promote sustainable growth, and modernized economies. Last but not least, carbon markets present a potential for job creation and economic diversification. So, ladies and gentlemen, the objective of this event today is to provide policymakers and development practitioners with insight into the current state and the future potential of carbon market in LDCs. As I conclude, the carbon market is not just a tool for reducing emission, but it is also an opportunity for LDCs to break free from the cycle of poverty and environmental degradation, to leapfrog into a future of sustainable growth, and to take ownership of their role in the global effort to tackle climate change. So let us commit today to build a carbon market that is fair, inclusive and beneficial for all, especially for those nations that need it the most. The time to act is now, and I strongly believe that all of us together on this call, or even other stakeholders who are not here, we can create a more sustainable, prosperous, and just world for future generations. So thank you so much, all of you, for your attention, and over to you, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Diane, and I think you've been able to outline, the key priorities that we need to concentrate on with regards to, this thematic area of carbon credit and carbon markets. So thank you very much for that, and we truly appreciate the partnership with UNCTAD on this very important, area for the continent. As you said, Diane, and I would like to build on what you just outlined in terms of priorities, calling for a fair, inclusive, and transparent, a carbon market to ensure that African countries are getting the fair share of what they deserve in terms of, resources. But to say that, let me put things on perspective. When you look at the continent, and you said it in your presentation, in your speech, you will see that Africa is contributing less, to global emissions, which is estimated at approximately 3% of global emissions. And unfortunately, it is the continent that is faced with the most important consequences of climate change. And those consequences are relating to the inabilities of countries to sustain economic growth and to develop a path of transformation that can allow them to exit from poverty and inequalities that are relating to that. This, climate issue is also creating a lot of problems within the continent related to the consequences relating to the mortality that is linked to climate adverse event. We can also allude to issues that are connected with the displacement of people in the continent and all over the globe. So there is need for us to have a comprehensive appreciation of what can be done in a context where African countries are faced with few resources to finance development, but also important threats that are linked to climate change. And the carbon market and carbon credits are one of the opportunities that we see looming ahead if African countries and least developed countries are to make the most of the resources that can be tapped in this direction. It is also important to note that Africa is the carbon sink of the world, because if you look at the contribution of the Congo Basin in terms of carbon emissions, in terms of, carbon, you will see that it is the carbon sink of the world. So there is need for us to keep that also into consideration and call for fair, transparent, and equitable markets in this platform, in this framework. One of the constant call of the African Union has been the need for a deep reform of the climate finance architecture as a whole, to make sure that all the components of the problems that we are facing and that LDCs are facing in this, could be resolved in a way that allows countries to create a space for economic growth and sustainable development. So it is important for us to keep that into consideration and to see that we have an opportunity as we are moving to the fourth Financing for Development Conference that is scheduled to be held in July in Spain. So there is need for us to be able, to design the right policy frameworks and also take the right decisions that are going to unlock the potential of the carbon market for development. With these few remarks, allow me, Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, now to move to the second segment of our session today, which is the presentation that we are all looking for to understand what are the imperatives for least developed countries to embrace, the carbon market, and how this market can contribute to development as we move forward. This presentation will be made by Rolf Traeger, who is from UNIDO. So Rolf, if you are ready, let me hand back the floor to you for your presentation.
You are muted.
You are muted for now. Yes,
okay.
now it's fine.
Oui, donc bonjour, merci Dr Olomo, et j'aimerais commencer en remerciant la disponibilité de l'Union africaine et de la Commission à se mettre ensemble avec la CNUSED pour la réalisation de cet atelier. Et j'aimerais d'ores et déjà commencer par remercier la présence de tous les experts. Maintenant, je vais passer à l'anglais et je vais vous montrer ma présentation. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. So let me start. I mean, as was mentioned, I'm Rolf Trigg. I'm chief of the LDC section in UNCTAD, and I will present the main conclusions and findings of the least developed countries report 2024, which was published recently. So I will structure my presentation around the three issues. First of all, what is the track record of LDCs and carbon markets so far? Second, what is the potential of carbon markets for LDCs? And finally, we'll come to the actions and policy issues of what can be done so that LDCs can better use the potential that carbon markets represent for these countries. So let me start by examining what has been the track record of the least developed countries in in carbon markets. So first of all, what we have seen is that LDCs have been quite active in carbon markets, despite their very minimal contribution to climate change, as was already mentioned. Let's not forget that whether you look at current emissions or at historical emissions ever since the 18th century, the LDCs have been responsible for between 3 and 4% of global carbon emissions. So it's absolutely marginal. But in spite of this, they have been participation in carbon markets, okay? And this on two occasions, both during under the Kyoto Protocol, which went from 1987 to 2020. So that was the era of the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism. And what we are living now is the transition and the beginning of the implementation of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And in both phases, LDCs have been active. So what we have seen is that, yes, LDCs were active during the CDM phase, the phase of the Clean Development Mechanism, but their participation in the CDM was limited by structural factors, especially the small size of their economies on a worldwide scale. And what we saw is, what we know is that CDM is essentially a mechanism to attract investment, including foreign direct investment. So it's no small wonder that LDCs had a very marginal participation in this mechanism. And during the period of in which this mechanism was in place, there were 7,800 CDM projects which were approved, but the LDCs accounted just for 1.5%. So yes, they were very active, but on a global scale, their participation was very much marginal. So, and what we see now in terms of their present participation in terms of current carbon projects, we see that they are very much concentrated on 6 LDCs, which are Bangladesh, Cambodia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Malawi, Uganda, and Zambia. So just these six out of the 44 LDCs accounted for 3/4 of all carbon credit issues under the voluntary carbon market, among all of those that are hosted in LDCs. So what about the effectiveness of these projects in mobilizing finance for LDCs? So what we have done here is that we have taken the total value of the nominal value of these projects, and we have compared with sources of external finance to LDCs. And so the total value of these projects, which I have just mentioned, is $400 million. And that's the total value of the project, which doesn't mean that this is the actual inflows that go to LDCs. And this compares to other sources of international financing of LDCs economies, which were in 2023 of the order of $31 billion in the case of foreign direct investment, FDI, $37 billion of bilateral ODA, official development assistance. So you can see that there is already a big difference. But if you compare those $400 million to the inflows that came from remittances, from workers' remittances back to LDCs, they were of the order of $66 billion. So we can see that the value, actual value of carbon markets was absolutely marginal compared to the major sources of external finance to LDCs. And this again is the nominal value of these projects. Doesn't mean that these are actual inflows to LDCs. So then beyond what are the actual inflows of external resources to LDCs, we wanted to compare these values, again, these $400 million, with the actual needs of financing of LDCs. And we had already done an estimate, always for the LDC report, of the financing needs for LDCs to need certain targets of the SDGs, of the Sustainable Development Goals. And one of them was the growth target, which is enshrined in SDG number 8, which is to attain an annual growth rate of 7% a year. And to reach these targets, LDCs will need annual investments of $162 billion. To reach another goal, which is the very first of the SDGs, which is poverty eradication, the orders of magnitude are similar for $185 billion annually. And this is throughout the 2020, start in 2021 until 2030. But if we talk about a much more ambitious goal, which is that of doubling the share of industry in GDP, which we take as a proxy of a structural transformation, that requires $1 trillion investment annually in all LDCs. So, and even if we would, here we have taken for comparison what is the potential of market value of represented by land-based mitigation projects in LDCs on a very positive scenario, which is a scenario where I have a market value of carbon, which is $100 per ton of CO2 equivalent. And that potential under this very optimistic scenario would amount to $6 billion in 2030 and $57 billion in 2050. So all of this to give an idea of the potential of carbon markets vis-à-vis the investment needs of LDCs. But even beyond this, we have also undertaken a series of case studies of actual projects which have been implemented in LDCs, most of them under the CDM. And we have done an analysis, a careful analysis under a series of criteria. Because LDC carbon markets, they are supposed to bring benefits beyond the financial benefits, what used to be called co-benefits. Nowadays, they tend to be called sustainable development benefits, such as technology transfer, education, community development, so building of schools, building of health clinics, etc., etc. And what we have seen from these case studies is that these benefits, they are very uncertain in LDCs. And it's important to keep in mind what has been the actual experience of LDCs from the engagement in carbon markets. So beyond what has already been the case, we also looked at the potential of carbon markets for the least developed countries. And so we took this estimate of land-based mitigation projects, which is something that comes from scientists associated to the IPCC. And these are projects essentially in the area of forests and land management, i.e. the fact of adopting very sustainable land management techniques, which means that the land can become a mechanism of carbon capture. So what we have seen is that the annual feasible cost-effective mitigation potential, again, under this very optimistic potential, would be of 642 megatons of CO2 equivalent. Okay, so again, what has been issued so far amounts to 41 megatons, so it's but a fraction, it's less than 1% of this potential. But still, I mean, this potential should not be discarded, because if you compare it with the emissions of the aviation industry, of the civil aviation industry, which is one of the major generators of CO2 emission, it is comparable. So these this potential in LDCs amount to 642 megatons, whereas the emissions of the global aviation industry were 950 megatons of CO2 equivalent. And we took the figure for 2019 to isolate from the effects of the pandemic. So it's important, all of this to say that yes, there is a potential for exploiting carbon markets in LDCs, but so far they have been tackled only to a very minor extent. It's less than 2% of this land-based potential. But I'd just like to recall that for this potential to be realized, it is very important that the carbon markets evolve in a very favorable way, because this supposes a world price of CO2, of the ton of CO2 equivalent, of $100. It's important to know that there is a huge variation in international prices of the ton of CO2 equivalent. It can go anywhere from less than $1 to $60 to $70 in the case of European markets. And it's so important, this is so critical, that if prices were to stay at $10 the ton of CO2 equivalent, more or less where they are right now, 97% of the mitigation potential in LDCs would not be economically feasible. So this is very important for policymakers and LDCs to keep in mind when deciding whether to participate or not in these markets. But also, I'd like to draw the attention, and this has already been mentioned this afternoon, that there is a huge potential for carbon markets in the area of renewable energy. And here it's important to bring to the fore the concept of suppressed demand. Of course, it's not that you have CO2 generation which is being there, but it's the issue of meeting this potential demand for energy, which is huge in the case of LDCs. And why is that so important? It's because in 31 out of 45 LDCs, when we wrote the report, less than 2/3 of the population have access to electricity. So there's a huge demand for electricity generation, transmission, and distribution. And if this were to be met by renewable, of course, there would be different goals which would be met, environmental goals, but also social goals and development goals, and the potential for structural transformation of these economies. But participation is subject to two major provisos. First of all, it does not come as a free lunch, because participation in carbon markets, it's costly. It requires infrastructure, technological capabilities, institutional capabilities to engage in a meaningful way in these countries. Because to establish in a serious way and to fend off possible criticism of greenwashing, it's important and essential to establish robust monetary reporting and verification protocols so that countries participate in a meaningful and credible way in these markets. So that's the first major proviso. There's a second major proviso that LDC policymakers need to keep in mind, and African policymakers in general, which is that the mitigation results which are transferred internationally, for instance, through ITMOs, etc., they trigger a corresponding adjustment of the emissions reported by the host country, i.e. the mitigation which is achieved through these projects which give rise to carbon credits, they cannot be claimed by the host country in their national determined contributions. They can be claimed by the actors, by the countries which acquire these carbon credits, but not by the host countries where these credits are generated. So this poses a challenge in terms of the future NDCs of the countries generating these credits. They will have to look elsewhere in order to claim their contribution to worldwide mitigation. So how can, given this, that participation, that LDCs have tried to participate actively, even though on a worldwide scale this hasn't been marginal, and that on the other side they have exploited just a very minor share of the potential that these carbon markets offer, what can be done for them to not just to exploit to a further degree the potential of these markets, but and crucially, that these participation in these markets contribute to their sustainable development. There are different actions and policy orientations that could and should be followed, not just by the LDCs themselves, but also by their southern development partners, but also by their worldwide development partners, i.e. by the international community as a whole. So first, in terms of what LDCs can do or should do in order to exploit this potential, they should have very clear what they expect to achieve by participation in carbon markets. They should have realistic expectation, both in terms of the finance that can be mobilized, but also in terms of their possible constraints on their policy space. And that's why they should develop a proactive and independent policy framework that defines the objectives, the priorities, and the scope of engagement in carbon trading. And particularly crucial in terms of this policy framework of domestic legislation are rules and institutions for the sharing of financial revenues. So how much goes to local communities? What share of the project values goes to the national government? What share goes to project developers, etc.? Which is a way of ensuring that different national actors actually benefit financially from these projects, but also which actors should be allowed to participate, and what share of emission reductions should remain in the country itself, so that not the totality of it is transferred elsewhere. It's again a matter of preserving national domestic policy space. And in this sense, it's very important that carbon markets are not looked in isolation of the rest, but that they are regarded as a tool for achieving national development goals. And here, I'm not talking just about environmental policy, but I'm talking about broader development policy. And that's why it's important that carbon market participation be regarded as an instrument alongside other types of development policy, such as industrial policy, fiscal policy, policies for science, technology, and innovation. Given that you have the financial aspect, but also the environmental aspect, the technology aspect, and the community development aspect of carbon projects. And that's why it's important for policymakers to favor projects in areas and sectors which have the most potential to contribute to the structural transformation, and particularly to the green structural transformation of their economies. Hence, projects in areas such as manufacturing, renewable energy, etc., are so important to target through the participation in carbon markets. So that's for priority actions for host countries themselves. But then there's also potential collaboration with southern partners. Why? Because we have seen that participation in carbon markets is costly. So one way to go around this is by pooling resources at the sub-regional level among the neighboring countries and developing common frameworks for project registry, for evaluation, etc. And this is something to have possibly common negotiating positions, common institutions, common legal frameworks, institutional frameworks, which would be a way of reducing costs, but also of strengthening the negotiating position of host countries. So this is an area where South-South collaboration and cooperation may boost the participation of LDCs and other African countries in carbon markets. but also, and supporting this, there's a role for the international community, particularly in terms of strengthening the capacity, strengthening the skills of policymakers and other actors in terms of participating in carbon markets. We know that this is technically very convoluted. There are all sorts of technicalities in terms of institutional development, of developing legal framework, regulation, apart from monitoring, measurement, frameworks, etc., etc. So it's very important to boost the national capacities to participate in a meaningful way in these markets. And it is just as important of transferring the skills and with the technicalities of domestic rulemaking, but also the requirement, the international requirements in terms of Article 6, etc., etc. It's important that this capacity building, which is already there, but there's scope for development. And it's important that this capacity development is not given in isolation from other aspects of development capacity building. And what do I mean by that? It's that carbon markets and capacity building and training for these markets should always be put in the perspective of broader national development policy making, i.e. what I mentioned a couple of minutes ago in terms of integrating these markets in the broader environmental policy, but also policies for the structural transformation of these countries, industrial policy, etc. And in this context, it's very important that the international community heeds the principle of common but differentiated responsibility when implementing carbon market rules through lower fees, more flexible rules, which facilitate the participation of LDCs in these markets, because it's important to take into account the specific conditions of LDCs when they go into participation in these markets. So I think I'll stop here, and I thank you very much. And once again, I'd like to thank the participation of all of those present in today's workshop.
Thank you very much, Rolf. That was excellent, and we truly appreciated listening to you, taking stock of the good conclusions that you were able to draw in your latest LDCs report. Having said that, you highlighted some key priorities that are important for LDCs and other African countries to take advantage of to harness the potential of the carbon market. So with this, allow me to shift to the next speaker, who is also connected with us online. He will share some perspective in his capacity of international consultant in the field of carbon market, and will also elaborate on the work that he has been doing here at the African Union when he was with us. So, Emmanuel, if you can take the floor, you will be most welcome. Yes. Excellent. You can see your screen.
Great, fantastic. So thank you very much, Patrick, and thanks, Rolf and Diane, for setting the scene. I'll simply dovetail what it is that my other colleagues have already shared, because carbon markets, as it were, friends, you realize that it's a fairly new area, especially in the continent of Africa. And usually I refer to it as just one of the tools in the toolbox. And so we shouldn't really overemphasize carbon markets at the expense of other viable options to climate action and climate finance, as it were, because then carbon finance and climate finance should not be used interchangeably. I think that is where the mix should actually be. That's where we should start by differentiating these two components. But just straight to my presentation, I don't intend to take so long. I think the previous speakers have already mentioned that Africa has the potential, right, for carbon markets. And this, of course, is due to its uniqueness to economic, social, environmental context. Are you aware that Africa's population is growing exponentially with a youth dividend? And so this is important for the uptake of, low carbon technologies, which is actually quite key for carbon markets, as it were. And because of this, then there has been a lot of interest, both at the global and regional levels, for sort of investing in carbon markets in the continent of Africa. But even as we do this, then we realize that governance is actually a key issue in the discussion of how the continent should engage in carbon markets and achieve the potential that it should, so that then the benefits go to the intended community members. So I just want to go straight to how it is that we could ensure that carbon markets then work better for the continent, as well as its development aspirations. And I think Ralph has already talked about this, so I may not want to say so much about this, but most importantly, number one is on restructuring carbon markets so that then we reduce poverty and vulnerability. I think that is the crux of the matter, because if carbon markets is an alternative, to climate action, it's an alternative to financing, then the idea is that carbon markets should then ensure that communities' poverty and vulnerability levels are elevated, right? But I think from what Rolf has presented from the LDC report, from SCMI report, from UNECA report, I think a couple of researchers have indicated previously that carbon markets have not actually been very significant in terms of contributing to sustainable development in LDCs. But there is a potential, right? There's a potential for shifting the needle so that then we ensure that carbon markets end up contributing to poverty elevation, right? So this will require that we set up very strong social and environmental safeguards. And the idea for the safeguards here is to ensure that then the carbon projects do no harm at all to the development and resilience of local communities, because these are the very vulnerable ones. And so we expect that carbon markets, as it were, then helps them to come out of the challenges that that they're already experiencing, rather than exacerbating those challenges. And that is extremely important. So we'll need the national and local institutions that Ralph talks about if you are to implement these safeguards. And then the institutions, of course, will be extremely important here to ensure that they hold the investors and developers accountable to ensuring that those carbon projects are contributing immensely to the development of the local communities by alleviating the poverty and vulnerability. Number two, we will need to enable cross-border carbon market development, right? And the reason is that the potential for carbon markets, as it were, doesn't just rest on one country. I think you're aware that this essentially spreads across the continent, across the globe. All right. And so you realize that if you are to develop, if you're to leapfrog the potential for carbon markets, then you require cross collaboration with other countries. But research has shown, of course, that only a few countries in the continent represent the vast majority of Africa's carbon credit portfolio. And that could be a reason why we are not leapfrogging as we should. So there is need for that greater regional coordination, and we can actually leverage the AfCFTA to do this, particularly now that the African Union is so concerned about greening the flagship projects of Agenda 2063, and CFTA is just one of them. So we could leverage this opportunity for, making sure that CFTA works across the continent so that then we're able to develop the carbon credits ecosystem across the continent. The African Union, again, has held a couple of multi-stakeholder workshops on carbon markets, and this has led to the development of what is called the Africa Action Plan for Carbon Markets, right? So the idea is to try and ensure that countries are the same level in terms of how they would like to engage in the carbon markets ecosystem. So the bottom line here is we'll need to have a common Pan-African carbon market, right? So that then we have entities being accredited to develop the regional projects. But even in the presence of this common Pan-African carbon market, it will be useful to still have those cross-country collaborations, especially for those countries that have regulations that are a bit comparable, so we can continue fostering that collaboration. Number three is the issue of resource rights. So we need to embed resource rights into the development of carbon markets. And I think this is extremely important. And for the continent, I think land is key. Land pops up as a very key resource, where communities must have rights to their land, because land is not just a resource, but it is many things. It's a source of livelihood, it's a customary thing. And so when you get communities out of their land in favor of carbon markets, then it means we are violating their rights. So it's important that we end up with some continental or subcontinental approach that can strengthen resource governance policies, in favor of clear allocation of resource rights to local population. That is extremely important. There has been a case in Kenya where some environment court ruled against the establishment of conservancies by the Northern Rangeland Trust, right? And the court is saying that the establishment of those conservancies violates the rights of the local communities, because then there was no proper participation into the establishment of those conservancies, and there was a violation again of the Community Land Act of 2016. So this then poses a problem, because if the Northern Rangeland Trust had some MOU of carbon markets, for example, then that is a challenge to the investors. So if we are to avoid this kind of impediments, then it is important that we align the carbon markets investments mechanisms with already existing frameworks, regulatory or otherwise, and constitutions or otherwise. So embedding resource rights into the development of carbon markets is extremely important. Number 4 is around accelerating the transition to carbon markets regulation. Now, you'll understand that the carbon market regulations are extremely important, because then they sort of ensure that the mechanisms around which you operate with the carbon markets are aligned with the national priorities, right? Which are often context specific, right? So then you're able to create clarity on how these projects and other market-related activities are to be conducted. Now, if you had an opportunity to read the gold standard carbon market regulations tracker, then you only realize that only 9 countries in the continent have developed and implemented carbon markets regulations. And of course, the development is one thing, implementation in another, because then it requires a lot of financial and human resources, as well as technical resources, institutional resources, and so on and so forth, as Rolf puts it. And that is where potentially where the development partners would come in, and the international community. And so these regulations are extremely important for managing carbon markets. Number 5 is on strengthening domestic capacity for carbon markets governance, right? Now, this is what I'm just talking about. In terms of strengthening the capacity, it means then that the carbon market stakeholders, so you're looking at local communities, the private sectors, the investors, project developers and buyers, and so on and so forth, are brought on board. So there is domestic actor participation, right? So that then there is equitable and just market, Now, when you have an equitable and a just market, then you foster trust. Issues around transparency, issues around credibility and integrity and so on now slowly fizzle out, because then everybody else is on the same page, right? So bringing on board the local actors is important, right? Because then they understand the context they work in, and so they're able to advise and even develop projects that will eventually ultimately lead to alleviating poverty and vulnerability. And so it's important that countries implement targeted capacity development of institutions and stakeholders, so that then we enable them to meet the needs of this growing market. And at this level, interventions, this intervention could be supported by regional partners. So I'm actually keen to bring in FDB, for example, and the Exim Bank and other philanthropies, because then we'll require grant funding to develop capacity at national and at subnational levels. And then number 6, and most importantly, again, is in de-risking investments so that we can attract domestic investors, right? I think for the longest, domestic financial institutions have been lacking in carbon markets across the continent. And then the reason is simple. I mean, it is costly. That is one. Point number 2, we have high perceived and real risks that are associated with these investments. Like this is what I've talked about on the ruling that the court in Kenya made. I think that is a risk already. If you've made your investments there, then that is in limbo. It's not so clear whether you still continue to claim the credits on the conservancies that a court has issued injunction or otherwise. So those are the real risks. Then others, of course, are perceived. And so we're saying that having a regional best risk management mechanism will be useful here, because then this mechanism would be, could remove or transfer the risks from the investors to other actors, such as the multilateral development banks and insurance companies and so on, so that they can bear and absorb those risks on behalf of the domestic investors. So this will enable these investors then to find reason and capital as well to participate in the market. And finally, on number 7, there will be need to link the development of the VCMs to the implementation of Article 6. I think for some of us who are at COP29 in Baku, of course, you realize that the parties finalized the negotiations on Article 6 around issues on VCMs, voluntary carbon markets. And so it's important, it's really, really important that parties during negotiations ensure that these agreements and implementation further builds on lessons that have been learned before, on clean development mechanisms, on RED Plus and VCMs, so that we are able to avoid the pitfalls even as we go forward, right? So I'm saying, for example, there will be need to ensure that accounting methodologies cover reductions and removal of emissions, right? So say through direct air capture by both Article 6 trading and the VCM. And as I've said, this is important because if countries are to maintain accurate and up-to-date knowledge of their stocks, as well as to have an understanding of the market and the function of their market, it is extremely important that this element is actually in place. So I leave it there for now. Patrick, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Merci beaucoup, Emmanuel, et c'était également une excellente contribution de votre part. Je pense que vous avez touché à 7 points essentiels qui sont en parfaite cohérence et en consonance avec les conclusions que Rolf nous a présentées il y a quelques instants. Et donc, pour cela, nous vous serons à jamais reconnaissants et nous vous remercions pour cette brillante prestation. Je vois que la question est tout à fait importante dans la mesure où elle suscite beaucoup de discussions et je pense que Emmanuel vient de conclure en évoquant ce qui s'est passé lors des rounds de négociation de la COP et de l'importance qui a été donnée justement au marché du carbone. Et donc pour cela, je voudrais appeler également à intervenir sur cette plateforme. Un autre intervenant qui, je crois, est connecté, si je ne me trompe pas. Je pense que nous avons M. Charles Boangui qui est connecté. Charles, si vous êtes là, est-ce que vous pouvez prendre la parole pour votre intervention?
Yes, I'm connected.
Excellent. So you have the floor, Charles, please. You can proceed.
All right. Thank you so very much, moderator. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are audible and we can see you too.
Thank you so very much. Well, I'm seated somewhere outside, so probably there might be a little bit of background noise, but I hope we can survive. But thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to engage in this conversation. And just in a way of introduction, I'm Charles Mwangi, and I work as Head of Programs and Research at the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. Now, I'll take a few minutes. Probably I might digress a little bit to give maybe a general perspective around this carbon market, concept. People have been thinking that carbon market is really a new concept, but this concept has been with us actually since 2006, 2007, with the Kyoto Protocol, at Kotov, with the CDM. And the big question that we do ask ourselves is, have we learned lessons probably that we were able to pick from CDM? Because now we have the new wave of carbon markets. From that particular time, now we have the second wave of carbon markets, and it's actually gaining traction. The discussion around carbon markets is gaining traction, and the concept has remained mysterious. And that is why this webinar is very important, because we have to demystify, this particular concept, because it has remained mysterious, just like it was those particular days. But maybe before I delve into my presentation, one thing that we must remember is that the IPCC continue informing us that we must reduce our emissions by a whopping 43% if we are to keep the 1.5 degree temperature rise alive. And these 43%, of course, part of it will come from Africa, but Africa only accounts about 4%. So about 39% may have to come from somewhere else, and this is from the high emitter countries. And this brings me to the question that we need to ask ourselves. Do we look at carbon markets as an instrument, for climate finance? Or do we look at carbon markets as a mechanism probably to reduce, the emissions that are already in the atmosphere? Now, if you look at carbon markets as an instrument or as an avenue to reduce the emissions from the atmosphere, then the question comes in, if a certain particular country, say country X, is actually emitting and paying, say, country B to reduce the emissions or to absorb the emissions that that country has already sent to the air, what is the net effect? If I'm producing 1 ton of carbon equivalent, but I'm paying someone else to actually absorb that 1 ton of carbon equivalent, what is the net effect in terms of the emission? And you realize that the net effect in actual sense is actually zero. Now, if you look at carbon markets as a mechanism then to provide climate finance, and climate finance to developing countries, and especially the LDCs, then the question is the price of carbon credit commensurate to the investment? And I think the first presenter or the second presenter actually made a very, very good presentation, that in actual sense, the prices of carbon or tons of carbon equivalent or the credits has remained low, and nobody has taken time to actually even figure out how much it takes to actually sequester 1 ton of carbon equivalent. I want to give you a small statistic here, that if you're looking at RAD-based, mechanisms for emission removals from the atmosphere, then it would require you have an acre for a whole 1 year to sequester 1 ton of carbon equivalent. Now the question is, if then I'm going to receive $5 or at most $10 for that investment, for committing that half piece of land for 1 year, am I really getting payment commensurate to the investment? And what is the foregone opportunity if that RAD was probably put for something else? I think these are big questions we need to ask ourselves. And then think about these statistics. And these are my own way of looking at my way of looking at things. If you look at the European Union, for example, in 2023, the total GDP for European Union was 18 trillion US dollars. Now, assuming that every sector of production resorts to emissions, which is true, because any sector of production has to do with logistics, it has to do with energy. And all these are actually factors that really also contribute to the emissions. Assuming then that this 18 trillion economy or GDP has been supported, in a way that we have also been able to emit emissions, then the total emissions for European Union in 2023 is about 2.5 billion. 2.5 billion tons of carbon equivalent. Now, if you divide the 18 trillion with that 2.5 billion tons of carbon equivalent, you realize that for every 1 ton of carbon produced, then that contributed to about 7,339, US dollars. Now, if I'm producing 1 ton of carbon equivalent and I'm gaining 7,339, dollars, and then I'm paying $5 for a ton of carbon equivalent, assuming that I'm selling all my carbon, then that one tells you there is a problem somewhere. That one country would continue probably producing and paying another country a very small amount of money, but then that country continue, producing and probably increasing, the GDP, at the expense of a country that is committing its resources, at a very low price, and to the extent that, in actual sense, you end up actually even having money flowing, from the continent or from the least developed countries going to somewhere else, because the investors who also invest, the project proponents. If you look at the benefit sharing mechanisms, also the question is how much even of the resource that comes remains with the communities, and how much gets to these particular project proponents, and where do these project proponents come from? So even as we talk about, the second presenter talked about 400 million money that was that accrued from carbon projects in LDCs, but how much of that remained in the LDCs? So I think these are important questions that we really must ask ourselves, even as we delve deeper into conversations around carbon markets and whether indeed really it makes business sense at the communities within the region. But then we ask ourselves, what are some of the challenges we experience in CDM? One, the communities didn't understand, just like they don't understand now, what it means to actually trade in carbon. And if you're already experiencing problems selling our coffee, our tea, our critical minerals, and we don't even dictate the price. We don't even contribute to the determination of price of these commodities that we can see with our own eyes. What about carbon? So we have to ensure that, in actual sense, communities are very well sensitized and they get to understand what they're getting into. Number two challenge that we did experience, with the CDM, is the fact that, like my colleague, Emmanuel has explained, this question of human rights violation in the implementation of carbon, markets was a big problem during the CDM era. And even this time around again, even with the coming of Article 6, we must ask ourselves, are the rights of communities safeguarded? Or, for example, in many countries, talk about Tanzania, for example, talk about countries like Liberia and many others, including Kenya, we have committed millions and millions of hectares. And this is community land, but sometimes we don't figure out probably what it means, in terms of the human rights for these communities. Emmanuel just mentioned about a case where the court, had to rule on the communities. So can we also make sure that human rights considerations are actually taken care of? Because that was one of the mistakes that we experienced, during, the CDM era. And again, benefit sharing mechanisms. You see, at the end of the day, when carbon money arrives, for example, how does it even reach communities? Most of the times, this money comes in form of community social projects. Could be a school, it could be a certain well somewhere, it could maybe a certain particular hospital somewhere. But sometimes we also count, per capita benefits. What does that mean, for every particular household? And really, is that commensurate against the investment and foregone opportunities? And I think those are some of the things that didn't go right. And of course, the price, like I did mention, because $5 to $10 is really, really very minimal. And that actually only happens within the LDCs in Africa. If you go to other markets, like in Europe, you realize a ton of carbon equivalent probably costs like 100. So why is it that we don't have this uniformity in terms of pricing, of the carbon credits that we sell? Then the other thing is about the technologies that are required and the technical capacity needed. I was involved in some of the first projects around carbon in 2006, 2007, when I was working for certain organization. And one of the challenges we did experience was the issue of even getting verifiers and validators. And even now, I don't think that capacity, we still have it in the continent. And I think it's important to think about technology transfer, like one of the presenters said. We must really empower our people and ensure that we have our own verifiers, our own validators, and that we even have our own local investors who probably are able to get into this particular business, and ensuring that, again, we look at the issue of de-risking like Emmanuel, has indicated. But now on the role of civil society actors in terms of the whole, conversation, we must continue lobbying, particularly for improvement of prices, to ensure that prices are set depending, or considering the investments that comes with the same. But again, it's also important, to ensure, like I did mention, that human rights considerations are taken care of. And again, that we are not, again, probably just allowing probably some countries to continue probably achieving the NDCs targets, while other countries will be struggling to achieve the NDCs. Because if you look at 6.2 on ITMOS, international transferred mitigation outcomes, you realize that before you actually even sell, your credit, you really must do whatever we call, ensure that we are selling correspondingly adjusted ITMOS. You must, first of all, account for probably what has gone out, and what is actually going to your NDCs. And what has gone out cannot actually be used, for you to be able to account for your own, NDCs. So what does this mean in terms of capacity of our countries to even meet, our very own NDCs, even as we sell, credits to other countries to support them in terms of basically selling, achieving their NDC targets. And overall, what is the net effect of this carbon project? Are they helping us in a way of reducing the emissions? Or are we probably creating licenses for people to continue emitting because carbon credits are cheap and we can buy even as continue emitting? I think these are critical questions. I may sound a bit political, but I think these are integral questions and very, very critical questions that we must ask ourselves, even as we dive deep into the carbon conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Charles. And you really outlined the key questions and also underlined the priorities that we need to concentrate on, to meet the challenges that we are facing in the carbon market. So this is really interesting, and I think it is powering the conversation as we move forward. And on this, allow me, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, to open the floor for quick questions that can be addressed to the three presenters that took the floor today, and also maybe add also some perspectives on what needs to be done proceeding forward. You have the opportunity to raise your hand and we will give you the floor for your intervention. Yes, I can see Daniel. Daniel, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear, Daniel.
Voilà. I'm coming from the food system and food security aspect, and then when we were also discussing regarding the CADEP and so on, we were always thinking that how could we make a carbon market, carbon development, carbon market or carbon credit projects contributing more to food security in Africa. Do we have some details, or are there some figures regarding how far projects were contributing to food security?
Thank you, Daniel. I think that is a very important question and is even straightforward. So thanks for that. Our presenters are going to certainly respond to the question. Second on the list is Millie Kadu. You have the floor.
Yeah. My name is Mele Kadu from Uganda. So I would like if we have any models that are in place to a maximum level of carbon credits that can be issued by the country. that looking at the fact that our population is growing exponentially of investments we undertake. So we need to know at most how carbon credits can be issued by a particular country, vegetation cover, not to compromise investment such as industry to allow sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Millie. And that is also an important question because we are linking the development of carbon markets with industrialization. Our next speaker is Mrs. Salimata. Salimata, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you so much to give me the floor. I would like to ask a couple of questions according to the decision made at COP 29, and the other one on the regional and cross-border collaboration. Concerning the decision made at COP 29, I want to reflect on, given the recent operationalization of the Article 6 at COP 29, what challenges do you foresee in ensuring the environmental integrity of carbon credits, and how can countries navigate these challenges? The other question according to that is, how can developing countries maximize their participation in international carbon market under the new frameworks established at COP29? And the question according to regional and cross-border collaboration is, how can African countries collaborate regionally to enhance their negotiating power and benefit from international carbon markets? And the other one is, what are the opportunities and challenges for cross-border carbon trading initiatives, particularly in transboundary ecosystems?
Thank you very much. I think the two questions are segmented into two, but there are four questions that you ably posed to our presenters. Now, allow me to move to the next speaker, Mr. Kubrat or Mrs. Kubrat.
Yes, sir. My name is
We can't hear you. Nous ne vous entendons pas. Can you move closer to the microphone?
No. Oh, wait. Can you hear
The line is breaking. We can guess that you are speaking, but unfortunately, we can hear you loud and clear.
me? Okay.
Can you try again?
Can you hear me
A bit better,
Can you
but
hear
still challenging. Yes, now we can hear you.
me now? Something else in my network.
No, Mrs. Kubrat, we can't hear you. We can't hear you at all. Maybe let us move to the next speaker as you are adjusting your microphone, and then we come back to you in a few minutes when you are ready. Mr. Shefford.
Good afternoon. Yes, this is Shepard Michur from SADC Secretariat. I just want to follow up on Emmanuel, who raised a very good point on the common Pan-African approach on carbon market. My comment is we are talking of three layers here. We are talking of the AU, African Union, as a motherboard. We are also talking, there are also RECs at regional level, the Regional Economic Commission, communities at regional level, and then we also have member states. And these are three layers, and each of them, they are doing what they are doing on carbon market, whether it's policies, whether it's, and then now we have the African Union, we are now developing the Africa Aspiration and Action Plan on carbon market. So now my comment is all these layers that you are talking about, they are not on the same page. Some they've started, some they are not started. Some they are even behind. So how do we pull together all these layers so that there's a common approach and that they are not working in a fragmented way of advancing or leveraging on carbon market? Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I see Prince Akoy.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity. I follow through of the presenters, and they make good points. But my issue here is that this challenge that we have as a this developing country as it relates to carbon market. I'm saying in the context of I'm from Liberia, and we are challenged when it comes to technology, when it comes to other issues and institutional issues as well, governance. So how can a country like Liberia form part of this carbon market, even though it is possible to be done through our nationally determined contribution, through the sectoral arrangement, but still some of our sectors still challenged. So what could be the best way forward to help a country like Liberia if it comes to carbon market? Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Prince. So, colleagues, we have a set of interventions as we speak now. Allow me to give the floor to the presenters. I will start with Rolf and then move to the others. Rolf, you've been able to listen to the excellent points that were raised, and thanks for your elaborate presentation at the onset. I think you have been able to open the space for a very interesting discussion on this matter. So what is your take on the questions that were raised? And we also give the floor to the other panelists. Rolf.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And I'd like to start by thanking the people who have made observations and made questions. I think that all of them are extremely pertinent at different levels. I cannot do justice to all of them, but I'll also let the other presenters come in, of course. So I'll touch on some of the points. On the issue of food security, this relates to the potential that there is to use carbon markets in the field of land management, etc. And I think that yes, there is a strong potential here, but it supposes the adoption of certain techniques of land management, etc. How do you cover the earth so that it can become an instrument of carbon capture, etc., etc. And the important point here is that not any form of agriculture, not any form of food production is liable to this. So it's very important to pay attention to the techniques that are used, to how land is management, rotation, fallow, using fallow earth, etc., etc. So here there is a very important role to be played by agricultural extension services, technical information, etc., etc. And this shows also the importance of having participation in carbon markets integrated with other areas of policy making. In terms of figures on that, I'm not aware of this, but maybe they exist. And this has to do with the issue of vegetation cover, etc. And also the issue of vegetation cover versus industrialization versus forest cover, etc., etc. And here again, it's important to have this holistic approach and to see where carbon markets can play a role. And again, I think that carbon market participation is only meaningful if it comes in the context of this broader context. yes, I mean, if you're going to develop industry, of course, this is area which is not going to be used to either agriculture or forest coverage, etc., etc. So, but I mean, there is a place, and there has to be a place for industry in the country's development, etc. So it's very important to consider these different issues, alternative uses of land at the same time, rather than rushing to development carbon projects, to put all of this within the broader development context. Okay, I mean, how to maximize development country participation? I think it's the essential point is that the way is not to have as many carbon projects as possible, but to have as many carbon projects that actually contribute to national development. So the point of departure is not the carbon markets themselves, but it's the national development plan. And hence, how does it fit into the plans, again, for industry, for agriculture, for forestry conservation, for the sustainable exploitation of forests, etc., because there's a role for that as well. So here, it's a second order how carbon markets can contribute to this. It's not, it's important not to privilege, let's rush to participate in carbon markets. No, let's get our priority right, and then let's look at carbon markets as a tool for this, as has been repeated by several speakers. And then on the issue of inter-country collaboration, I think that there is a very strong potential for this. But again, this will not come automatically. So it's very important for both RECs, countries within their sub-regions, but also the EU to mobilize. Then there is an issue of inter-institutional collaboration and of different temporalities, because we know that at the sub-regional sphere, some sub-regions are moving in one speed rather than the other. Some RECs are more active than the other, and the EU has its own temporality. So I agree that this is a challenge to have all of this, supporting each other and to have coherence. Of course, I concede that this is easier said than done. And again, how do countries go about participating? Let me just repeat our point that the fundamental issue is that participation should be subsumed to broader issues of development policy. And I think I'll stop here. I think that my colleagues have also several points to make. Thank you very much for your questions again.
Thank you very much for the responses, Rolf, and allow me to move to Emmanuel. Emmanuel, are you still connected? Can you take the floor?
Thanks, Patrick. I'm still here. And thanks, Rolf. I think you did justice to literally all the questions. So maybe just to weigh in on a few, and thank you, friends, for the questions. I think the issue around carbon markets and food security is a critical one. And it's very, it's contentious, if I may. I mean, if you were to piggyback the statistics that Charles was talking about, having half an acre for a whole year to sequester just a ton of carbon, and the pricing for that just being about $5 or so per unit. Then, because the idea then would be that you're looking for resources from carbon markets to finance your agricultural sector, and therefore sort of sustain the food security component. But if you are to look at that kind of analogy, then there is a problem, right? So I think the point would be, as Rolf says, to align your carbon markets with national priorities. Because if you do that, then you realize that there are key sectors that you're also looking at. There's agriculture, there is forestry, there is energy, there's manufacturing, and so on and so forth. So then as you do your alignment into the national plans and policies and strategies and action plans, then that is going to help you then know whether by engaging in carbon markets, you are actually raising the lever for food security or jeopardizing it. Right. So I think this will be left for the nations to decide. I mean, it's not something that we may want really to prescribe at this particular point. So it's about trying to have trade-offs, but most importantly, align your carbon markets investments into your national priorities. Shepard, you ask a very diplomatic question. And you and I know that I may not be able to do justice to this question for now, but because the point is, the Africa Union Commission has two mandates majorly. So it's around policy and coordination, right? So the AUC will set the continental policies, and the assumption usually is that the RECs and the member states then would align theirs with the continental ones. But as you rightly put it, sometimes the member states and the RECs already have some frameworks in place, even before the AUC puts the frameworks in place. And so it becomes a little bit challenging. But I think the point would be that cross collaboration here would be important, so that then we pick lessons learned from the member states, from the RECs, and therefore see how we can align all these in a manner that allows the continent to work as one, right? As a Pan-African institution. If we can pick best practices in carbon markets and see how well it is that we can have other countries that are struggling leverage on those best practices, I think we're able to set some common grounding. But it's not so easy, because the point is, even though the AUC sets the continental frameworks, it's not legally binding for the RECs of the member states to align their frameworks with this. The AUC just provides guidance, all right? And of course, some coordination mechanisms to ensure that everybody else is on board. So it may not necessarily be something that I want to weigh in so much for now, because Shepard, I may not have the exact answer to this, but that is the much I can say for now. And then just finally on, I think what, I can't remember her name, on regional collaboration and cross-border collaborations. I think I did mention here that it would really suffice. Rolf says it's difficult, of course, but it will suffice if the countries that are collaborating have some comparable kind of regulations, right? So then it makes it easy for them to have this regional cooperation in carbon markets. But if the regulations are a bit different, then it becomes a challenge altogether. And that is where now the second question comes in. So it's about trying to map out which of the countries sort of align with your regulations, and how then do you piggyback those regulations to ensure that you sort of capitalize a lot more on the carbon markets investments in the country. I'll leave it there for now, Patrick. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manuel, and excellent points also raised. I think you highlighted key issues and priorities that we need to concentrate on. I can see there is still a hand up, and I do hope that Kubrat could now intervene. So Kubrat, if you are there, take the floor, please.
Hello, can you hear me now? Can everyone hear me now?
Excellent.
Thank you very much. I'm so sorry for the technical difficulties. So my question actually focuses on carbon border taxes. With LDC source carbon credits valued at only $0.4 billion compared to FDI at 31 billion, I just would like to know, how can border pricing mechanisms, specifically on CBAM, be leveraged to kind of redirect foreign investment into LDC-based carbon markets, particularly on leveraging differential tax structures or some sort of blended finance models that can be designed to make LDC carbon assets more competitive in the global market. I would love if Ralph would be able to answer this question, but it's also open to other presenters as well. And then my last question is mainly focused on the legal side of regulatory, something that Emmanuel mentioned during the presentation. So I would just like to know if there are specific policy reforms that can be created to enable more or very much of a legal environment for foreign investors in carbon markets. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As I see no other requests for the floor, so allow me to move to Charles for your quick comments on the questions, including the last one by Kubrat. Charles? Are you still with us? No, he's no longer.
Patrick, Charles disconnected. He had to leave to catch a flight, so he's no longer on the call.
Yes, I can see it. So thank you very much, Judith, for that. So this last question, Rolf, you certainly heard about the two segments of the question that was raised by Kubrat. What is your take about this? You are muted.
Hey, thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Kubrat, for the question. Well, actually, I mean, the question is how to leverage markets and how to attract investors, etc., etc. I think that, I mean, beyond the fact that policymakers have to be realistic of what they can achieve and not think that this is a replacement for either development finance or climate finance, these are very different things. But still, I mean, there is a potential which can be tapped. I think that the very first thing, the very first step is developing their own policy frameworks and devising clear guidelines, particularly in terms of benefit sharing of the portions that accrue to local communities, to national governments, not just in terms of finance, but also in terms of the abatement itself, so that it can possibly part of the projects can be claimed when the countries are formulating their NDCs, etc. So I think that the very first step is formulating a very clear, to have a positive and proactive agenda concerning the objectives and the rules. And then the rest that comes from it, the institutions, laws, how do you measure emissions, how do you register, etc., etc. And there, based on this, you have to look at your own capacities. Do you have these capacities in country or not? If you don't have, how can you develop them? Is there scope for intra-country collaboration within the REC, or is it taking guidelines from the AUC, etc., etc. So I think that the very first step is for policymakers to have clarity, that bring clarity on the objectives, on the rules of the game, that bring transparency to projects and to the sharing of benefits. I think that this is the very first benefit. And then you have all the rest of starting negotiations with project developers, whether they are national or international, etc., etc. Again, this requires a proactive stance rather than waiting for then governments waiting to be approached by project developers. It's very important to have this proactive stance. And even if they are approached, there's nothing wrong about this, but to be very clear on objectives and on the conditions of this. Again, the important thing is not to maximize the number of projects, but to maximize the development benefits. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rolf. Emmanuel, your take on this, the last question.
Thanks, Patrick. And unfortunately, I was really struggling to hear Kubrat, but going by what Rolf has said, I don't want to dilute that. Rolf has been spot on, unless there is something that's really burning. So I'll leave it at that for now, Patrick. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Do we still have another request for the floor? I see that we are 17 minutes before the end of the meeting. So if there is any other request for the floor, maybe clarification, as questions were asked and responses provided.
Excuse me, Dr. Patrick, I think we have some comment in the chat as well. Have like
yes,
one
I can see a hand. Malambo, you have the floor. And the comments in the chat, we are going to move them. Maybe Judith, you can assist with a comment in the chat so that you can let us know. Malambo, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you so much. Good afternoon. Can you get me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I think in the first presentation, we saw about the opportunity of having the South-South cooperation. I just wanted to find out what role can that cooperation really play on best practices in the CDF project implementation among the LCDs. Like what expertise can this cooperation really bring on board the LCDs for the space?
Thank you very much. Judith, can you look at the chat maybe and let us know if there are questions there or contributions? Judith, please.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Patrick. I think there are a couple of comments and questions. There's one from Ryan Kunanan, and he's asking whether the Asian countries were involved, such as the Philippines. I'm not sure what this, so maybe Ryan, you could clarify on this. A second comment is one of the priorities of Africa is to have skills to assess carbon and to validate the figures communicated. So we need to have simplified formulas to evaluate carbon. This is from Anicet Obue from the Ivory Coast. Nelson Ogero is asking, how can one get skills to assess and verify carbon credits? And finally, Rahul Rana is asking, how should the government see the interaction of direct aid versus carbon market finance to achieve similar climate goals? LDCs usually understand direct aid compared to complex carbon markets. So should they not look to get direct aid to reach their climate goals? And that's it for the comments and questions from the chat.
Excellent. Thank you, Judith. And Malambo, I can see your hand is still up. Is it an old hand or do you still want to take the floor? So old hand.
That's a very first hand.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Excellent. Rolf and Emmanuel, certainly you've heard Judith speaking to the issues that were raised in the chat. What are your final comments? Because we are now rounding up to conclude our discussion today. And this will be also considered as your conclusion for the webinar. The floor is yours, Rolf.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And again, thank you for the remarks and the questions, which again point to very important issues. On the involvement of the Asian countries, I'm not sure what that refers to, but if it refers to the negotiations of the rules, which are, I mean, as was mentioned in COP29, there were a series of rules on Article 6, which were finally agreed. And of course, I mean, again, there's a multilateral process. All countries from all regions were involved, including the LDC group, including the African group, etc. Of course, some are more active than others, but I mean, that's very normal in any multilateral negotiations. On the issues of skills, and here again, there are two questions on the issues of skills. This is absolutely important to develop these skills. And because of the complexities that you have to go, because as was rightly pointed out, ODA is something, official development assistance, is clear to understand, you receive the money, you have projects, etc. Whereas in the case of carbon market, it's very convoluted, it's subject to a series of decisions, etc., which means that its management, negotiations requires even more skills than benefiting from ODA, from etc., etc. All of this to say that yes, skills are very important. Now the question is, how do you develop them? And I think that on the side of the international community, there are a number of initiatives on developing skills in order to allow countries, including African countries, to participate in carbon markets. So for instance, the UNFCCC has a full-fledged program of capacity building for participation in carbon markets. It has regional centers, etc., etc. UNDP is also active in this, but also bilateral donors. The European Union has several projects in capacity building. So it's not to say that there are not initiatives around, they are there. The problem is that the needs, they are so dire that the amount of resources, the amount of projects, they should be much higher than what already exists. So how should the countries go about it? If they are considering participating in carbon markets, they should put it as part of their demands for bilateral assistance, their demands to the UNFCCC Secretariat, to UNDP, etc., to other bilateral donors. So again, it's a matter of countries being proactive and identifying who the priority beneficiaries of this training and capacity building should be. They should single out, set out whatever departments, groups, working groups, task forces, or whatever, in order to build their skills on carbon markets. And then on the issue that was rightly pointed out, carbon markets are complex, whereas, and something new, as was already mentioned here, whereas official development assistance, developing countries have been dealing them for decades now, etc., with all the difficulties which are associated. But it's a fact of life of most developing countries. And also, but I mean, also there are some complexities of how to deal and how to negotiate the best form of ODA. But I think it's very important to separate. These are different forms of finance and they have different logics and different objectives. So countries that benefit from official development assistance should continue, again, negotiating with bilateral donors, with multilateral donors, and this should be separated from carbon finance. It's very important to realize that the dimensions are different, but also the logic and the objectives are different. So carbon finance is no replacement for either ODA, official development assistance, or for climate finance. Carbon finance is not climate finance. These are different things. And this is very important for policymakers to keep in mind. One does not obviate the other. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rolf. Emmanuel, your final points?
Thanks, Patrick. And just to pick up from where Rolf lives, I think the Paris Agreement is very clear in terms of the obligation of the global north as far as climate action is concerned. And ideally, the developed nations need to provide three things to the developing countries that are contributed the least to climate change. So there is finance, there is technology transfer, and there is capacity building. right? So the component of finance in these three, as Rolf says, cannot be equated to carbon finance. So that is completely different, right? So you have, as I said earlier, you have to begin by first drawing a line between carbon finance and climate finance. The moment you mix the two, then it becomes very difficult for you to move forward in terms of how then you want to negotiate bilaterally or otherwise for aid or whatever it is that you want.
Thank you, Emmanuel. I think this is excellent, and it concludes the round of questions and responses to those questions. Now we are moving to the concluding part of our excellent webinar today. Allow me to give the floor to my sister, Diane, to take the floor and to give her concluding remarks. Diane, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Patrick. Let me first of all really thank you specifically, Dr. Patrick, and your team at the African Union Commission for co-organizing this interesting webinar. It was a very productive event, and even now we still have like some comment and questions in the chat. But unfortunately, we are running out of time, so we have to conclude. So it was really a very exciting topic and an interesting one. Maybe in the coming days, we can organize another session to follow up. So thank you so much, Patrick and the team. Allow me also to thank Rolf as well as Emmanuel for the two presentations. They were very, very useful, where Rolf really focused on the fact of LDCs that should have a clear and realistic expectations. That was very well noted. And thank you, Emmanuel, as well, in your presentation, where you focused on some of the key challenges such as governance, and also emphasize on the greening of IFC-FTA, as well as the acceleration of the transition to the carbon regulation. So these are like some few key points I managed to note, but your presentations were very, very useful to the audience, and they are all of them very excited, and I see they are requesting even copies of the presentations. Of course, you will receive the copies of the presentations. I also want to thank Charles Mwangi. He's no longer on the call, but he also shared his thought on this topic. And last but not least, I want to thank you all the participants for your comments, for your questions, for your recommendation. It was really very useful and really contributed to this growing topic. And as I conclude, let me really focus on like to remind you some of the three key points from the UNCTAD report, LDCs report. So number one is about strengthening the domestic framework, which is very important. Number two, it was on expanding international partnership and collaboration with all the stakeholders. Number three, it's about prioritize capacity building. Capacity building is also very important, and many presenters really come back to the capacity building aspects. So without taking too long, really, thank you all for attending this session. And if I may request, maybe we want to take like a group photo. If you can put on your camera and mute your microphone so that we can take a very nice closing photo. Please.
Thank you very much, Diane. And it is also, for us, a very, very important meeting that we had today. We really appreciate the collaboration with UNCTAD. We appreciate also the growing momentum that we can see, in spearheading initiatives that are aimed at addressing the structural issues that the continent is facing. With this, I would like to really thank Rolf, thank Emmanuel, thank the panelists, and also thank all the speakers. and the participants on behalf of the African Union Commission ensure you that it is one of our priority to make sure that Africa remains at the top of the agenda. Be mindful of the fact that we are members now of the G20 and that this conversation on the carbon market is at the center of the points that we are raising there in terms of advocacy and in terms of the call that we are formulating for, an equitable, inclusive, fair and transparent carbon market that is fit for purpose for development. And on this, I think you have already outlined the key priorities that were, referred to during the presentations and the discussion, but allow me on our side to share some perspective. The first is that you insisted all on the need for policy coordination to make sure that we speak the same voice and that we have the same, policies as we move forward. The second point was on strengthening regional markets coordination also to make sure that those markets are able to enhance, resource value chains. We spoke about industrialization and the others implication in terms of food security. The third point was to invest on skills and on technology. And I think this was one of the main points that came into the conversation. The 5th point is about expanding the use of technology, the use of innovative financing mechanism to make sure that we are not, jeopardizing the momentum that we see now in the carbon market, and also taking into account the opportunities into other financing areas. The 6th point was on data, because you insisted consistently on the need for data. Data are essential because they are paving the way for, data-driven policy recommendations that are formulated by our member states. And lastly, I think Emmanuel alluded to the need for the international community to, abide by the principle of meeting the commitments that are made in all instances. And I think, to conclude, one of the points is about the need for stronger multilateralism, a multilateralism that speaks to the issues of all the countries, but more importantly for developing countries as we move forward. So thank you very much for that. I think we are right on time to conclude this meeting. Thanks to all. Thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you, Ralph. Thank you, Diane, for the collaboration, and looking forward to having a follow-up of, on this discussion with you very soon. Thanks to all the participants, and may you have a blessed weekend. It is the Valentine's Day today, so wishing you all a happy Valentine's Day. So goodbye and see you very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.